In the 16th century, the Spanish Empire was the most powerful force on the planet. There's really no debate. It was an empire of superlatives. An empire so vast that the sun truly never set on it, a claim it could make decades before the British. An empire with armies, the terrifying Spanish tercios, that were basically undefeated on the battlefields of Europe. And above all, an empire of almost unimaginable wealth. Pause, this wasn't just about gold. They had found something much, much bigger. In 1545, in the Andes Mountains of modern-day Bolivia, they hit the jackpot, a literal mountain made of silver. The Cerro Rico, the rich mountain of Potosi, was a geological freak of nature. It was a fountain of wealth that, combined with all the gold from Mexico and Peru, should have locked in Spanish dominance for 1,000 years. It was such a massive windfall that it seemed to confirm what the Spanish already believed, that God had chosen them, personally, to rule the earth. And yet, it was a trap. This mountain of treasure, instead of cementing their future, became a poison. It seeped into the foundations of their economy, hollowed out their industries, paid for endless wars, and ultimately, brought the whole magnificent building crashing down. The river of silver flowing into Spain created this glittering illusion of prosperity, but it was just masking a completely broken system underneath. So how does the richest empire in human history, an empire with more precious metal than any civilization before it, go bankrupt? Not just once, but over and over and over again. Philip II, the king who owned half the world, declared bankruptcy 4 separate times. This is the story of that spectacular collapse. It's not a story about one big, decisive battle. It's the story of a slow, grinding failure caused by a series of hidden financial traps, a set of invisible tethers that turned Spain's greatest strength into its fatal weakness. These are the top 10 hidden tethers that collapsed the Spanish Empire. Section 1. Tether number 10. Population and agricultural strain. To understand just how fragile this Spanish giant was, we have to start not with silver or armies, but with the very land of Spain itself and the people who worked it. Because long before the silver fleets ever set sail, the heartland of the empire, Castile, was already getting tired. Spain in the 16th century was a land of paradoxes. It was the center of a global empire, but its own population was tiny compared to rivals like France. This was a critical vulnerability. The crown's imperial dreams needed a constant supply of two things: money and men. And Castile was expected to provide both. As Spain's wars got more intense, the demand for soldiers became insatiable. Young men were pulled from farms and villages to go fight in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Germany, and against the Ottoman Empire. This constant brain drain of manpower had a devastating effect on the countryside. With fewer people to work the fields, agricultural output started to stagnate, and in some places, it just collapsed. This created a vicious cycle. A weaker agricultural base can't support as many people, and a smaller population means fewer soldiers and taxpayers, which puts even more strain on the crown's resources. Then came the plagues. The 16th and 17th centuries saw wave after wave of epidemics that wiped out huge chunks of the already strained population. The Great Plague of Seville in 1649 was a nightmare, killing nearly half the city's population and wrecking its economy for decades. Cities that had been major centers before 1492 started to empty out. In fact, it took until the mid-18th century for Madrid to become the first Spanish city to have more than 100,000 people again. This internal decay made the empire brittle. When shocks came from the outside, there was no demographic or agricultural cushion to absorb the blow. The constant, crushing taxes needed to fund the empire's wars led to deep resentment and internal rebellions. Uprisings in Portugal and Catalonia in the 1640s weren't just political squabbles, they were born from the exhaustion of regions that simply couldn't carry the weight of Castile's imperial project anymore. This first tether, the slow rot of its human and agricultural foundations, meant the Spanish Empire was a giant built on hollow ground. Section 2. Tether number 9. Repeated sovereign bankruptcies and credit freeze. Imagine you're a banker in the 16th century. The King of Spain, the most powerful man in the world, asks you for a loan. He offers you a piece of the next silver fleet. Sounds like the safest bet on earth, right? Wrong. Lending money to the Spanish crown was one of the riskiest things you could possibly do. This brings us to our 9th tether: Spain's addiction to debt and the cycle of bankruptcies that destroyed its credibility. King Philip II inherited a poisoned chalice from his father, Charles V. Charles had spent his reign fighting wars on every front, borrowing insane amounts of money from German and Italian bankers to pay for it all. When Philip II took the throne in 1556, he was already drowning in debt, owing around 36 million ducats, a sum that was roughly 6 times the entire annual income of his kingdom. Less than a year into his reign, the inevitable happened. In 1557, Philip declared the first of his 4 major bankruptcies. Now, a royal bankruptcy wasn't like a modern one. You can't exactly liquidate a king. Instead, it was a unilateral, "I'm not paying." The crown would tell its creditors that the short-term, high-interest loans they were owed were now being forcibly converted into long-term government bonds, called Juros, at a much lower interest rate. It was a coerced restructuring that wiped the immediate slate clean for the king but completely shattered the trust of his lenders. This happened again in 1560, 1575, and 1596. Each time, it sent a shockwave through the European financial system. The bankers, mostly from Genoa by this point, weren't idiots. After each bankruptcy, they got more and more wary. To compensate for the massive risk of lending to a serial defaulter, they charged the Spanish crown insane interest rates. While rivals like the Dutch and English could borrow money at 4–5%, Spain was often forced to pay 15%, 20%, or even more. In one case, a short-term loan came with an annual interest rate of a jaw-dropping 48%. This created a death spiral. Spain had to borrow more and more just to cover the interest payments on its existing debts. The constant need for cash to pay its armies meant Philip had no choice but to accept these terrible terms. The bankers, in turn, would lend the money, get burned in the next bankruptcy, and then jack up the rates even higher for the next round. By the end of Philip's reign, the crown's credit was garbage. And this had dire consequences. While England and the Dutch Republic were building sophisticated public debt markets that let them fund their armies and navies cheaply, Spain was being frozen out of international finance. The world's richest empire had become its worst credit risk, a tether that was slowly choking off the financial oxygen it needed to survive. Section 3. Tether number 8. Endemic corruption and elite diversion. While the king in Madrid was declaring bankruptcy, another cancer was eating away at the empire: systemic, endemic corruption. The river of silver from the Americas was so huge and so tempting that it created a culture of graft that stretched from the highest officials in the Spanish court all the way down to the lowest administrators in the colonial mines. This is our 8th tether: the siphoning of wealth by corrupt elites. The problem started at the source. In the colonies, a huge portion of the silver mined never even made it onto the official treasure fleets. Colonial elites, from governors to mine operators, became experts at smuggling and underreporting. They diverted massive amounts of silver to be traded illegally, lining their own pockets and robbing the crown of its crucial, royal fifth, the 20% tax on all precious metals. But the corruption was just as bad back home. The court of Philip III was dominated by his royal favorite, the Duke of Lerma. Lerma basically ran the government and used his position to build an astonishing personal fortune. His most famous scheme was a masterclass in graft. In 1601, he convinced the king to move the capital of Spain from Madrid to Valladolid. Lerma, of course, had used his insider knowledge to buy up tons of property in Valladolid beforehand. Once the capital moved, his real estate values went through the roof. A few years later, after he'd cashed in, He convinced the king to move the capital back to Madrid in 1606, supposedly after being paid off by Madrid's city leaders. This kind of behavior at the very top set the tone for the entire government. Positions in the government weren't seen as a public service, they were seen as a personal business opportunity. The crown's desperation for cash only made it worse. As we'll see, it started selling off administrative jobs to the highest bidder, making sure that these roles were filled not by the most competent people, but by the ones most eager to exploit their position to get their money back, and then some. The economic consequences were devastating. This corruption created unpredictable cycles of inflation and deflation, as huge sums of money were pulled out of the official economy and then dumped back in. It destroyed any faith in the government and made real financial reform impossible. The silver of the New World was supposed to be the property of the Spanish crown. Instead, a huge chunk of it was being illegally diverted into the private bank accounts of a parasitic elite, bleeding the empire dry from the inside out. Section 4. Tether number 7. The sale of offices, titles, and juros. Faced with a constant, desperate need for cash and no one willing to lend to them, the Spanish monarchs turned to a solution that gave them immediate relief but was incredibly destructive in the long run. They started to sell off the state itself. This is our 7th tether, mortgaging the future by selling offices, titles, and government bonds. This wasn't just borrowing money, this was privatizing the government and selling future income for a quick pile of cash. First was the sale of public offices. Want to be a town councilman, a court clerk, a tax inspector? In Habsburg Spain, you could often just buy the job. This had terrible consequences. It meant government posts were filled by people with money, not talent or integrity. And anyone who bought their office naturally saw it as an investment. They would then use their job to extort fees and bribes to make a profit, which just fueled the culture of corruption. Second was the sale of titles of nobility. For a big fee, a rich merchant could buy a title and become a nobleman. This seemed like a harmless way to raise money, but it had a sneaky, poisonous effect. The Spanish nobility had big privileges, the most important being that they were exempt from most taxes. So every time the king sold a title, he was creating another wealthy family that would no longer help pay for the state. He was trading a one-time payment for a permanent loss of future tax revenue, shrinking the very tax base he so desperately needed. The third and most financially devastating component was the reliance on juros and asientos. As we saw, juros were long-term government bonds. To get quick cash, the crown would sell more and more juros, promising future tax income to the bondholders. This was like taking out a mortgage on the country's entire future. By the reign of Philip IV, just paying the interest on these juros was eating up to half of the crown's entire annual income. Asientos, the short-term loans from foreign bankers, meant that a huge chunk of Spain's wealth was being immediately siphoned off to Italy and Germany in the form of interest payments. It was a system that generated quick cash at the cost of long-term solvency. The Spanish crown was essentially cannibalizing itself, selling off its administrative integrity, its tax base, and its future income just to stay afloat for one more day. This tether made sure that even when new silver arrived, most of it was already gone, used to pay off old debts rather than building the future. Section 5. Tether number 6. The decay of the Sevillian trade system. For over a century, the city of Seville was the beating heart of the Spanish Empire. It was the single gateway through which all the wealth of the Americas legally had to pass. Its inland port on the Guadalquivir River had a royal monopoly on all trade with the New World. This system was the central nervous system of the empire's finances. So when it started to decay, it was a mortal blow. This brings us to our 6th tether, the collapse of the Sevillian trade monopoly. In the 16th century, Seville was one of the richest cities in the world, a bustling hub where merchants from all over Europe gathered to get a piece of the New World action. The monopoly, in theory, gave the crown total control, allowing it to easily tax the silver and gold flowing in. But the system had a fatal flaw: its location. By the early 17th century, ships were getting bigger, and decades of traffic were causing the Guadalquivir River to fill with silt, making it harder and harder to navigate. The once secure inland port was becoming a liability. The nearby port of Cadiz, right on the Atlantic coast, was a much more practical deep-water harbor. The physical decay of the port was matched by a decay in the system itself. The rigid monopoly became a bureaucratic nightmare. Official interference, endless paperwork, and massive corruption made legal trade slow and expensive. Merchants started to engage in smuggling through other ports, bypassing Seville and the king's tax collectors entirely. Foreign competitors, especially the Dutch and English, got bolder, trading directly and illegally with Spain's own colonies. The final blows came in the mid-17th century. The Great Plague of 1649 devastated Seville. At the same time, the silver fleets themselves began to falter. Silver production was slowing, and the fleets were under constant threat. For several years around 1640, the silver fleet was halted altogether. This was catastrophic. The entire financial structure of the state was built on the predictable arrival of American silver, which was promised to bankers years in advance. When the fleet stopped, the whole system snapped. Recognizing the inevitable, the crown finally broke up the monopoly. Trade was gradually shifted to Cadiz, and in 1717, the House of Trade was officially moved there, ending Seville's golden age. But it was too little, too late. The central pillar of the imperial economy, the state-controlled monopoly on American trade, had crumbled. Its loss meant the loss of control, the loss of reliable income, and the final unraveling of the financial architecture that had propped the empire up for 150 years. Section 6. Tether number 5. Industrial and production stagnation, the Dutch disease. With a mountain of silver at its command, Spain should have been able to build the most advanced economy in the world. Instead, the silver acted like a drug, lulling the country into an industrial slumber it wouldn't wake up from for centuries. This is our fifth tether, and it's maybe the most insidious one: the curse of easy money, a phenomenon we now call the resource curse, or Dutch disease. The term was coined in the 20th century, but Spain was the original, and most extreme, case study. Here's how the curse worked. The massive flood of silver caused rampant inflation, which made Spanish goods, like textiles or tools, incredibly expensive. At the same time, it gave Spain an enormous amount of purchasing power. The crown and the elites had what seemed like unlimited cash. Why would you bother with the difficult, long-term process of building a factory when you can just use your silver to buy finer, cheaper cloth from the Netherlands or better ships from England? The result was a hollowing out of the Spanish economy. Local industries just couldn't compete. It became cheaper to import almost everything than to make it at home. Spanish money, instead of being invested in new technologies or businesses, was spent on lavish luxuries, government bonds, or buying noble titles. Entrepreneurship was crushed. The safest and most respected way to have wealth was in land or government IOUs, not in a risky new company. The statistics are shocking. Even in critical military industries, Spain fell behind. During a major revolt in the late 16th century, Spain had to import an estimated 80% of the weapons it needed to put down the rebellion. The empire that was constantly at war couldn't even make its own guns efficiently. Spain was exporting raw materials, like its high-quality wool, and then importing back the finished cloth at a much higher price. It was a classic colonial economy, but Spain was imposing it on itself. This created a profound dependency. The Spanish economy was addicted to its silver transfusion from the Americas. This wasn't a problem as long as the silver kept coming. But when the American mines started to produce less and the treasure fleets became less reliable in the 17th century, the consequences were dire. Spain had no diverse, modern industrial base to fall back on. The easy money had destroyed the incentive to build a real, sustainable economy, leaving the empire a hollowed-out shell, rich in treasure but poor in everything that actually mattered. Section 7. Tether number 4. Chronic military overextension. The Spanish Empire was, above all else, a war machine. Its whole identity was forged in conflict, against the Protestants in Northern Europe, the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, France in Italy, and England on the seas. This relentless, multi-front warfare wasn't just a feature of the empire, it was a core reason for its downfall. Our fourth tether is this chronic and ruinously expensive military overextension. The Habsburg kings didn't see the American wealth as something to build up their country with. They saw it as a divine war chest, a gift from God to fund their crusade to defend and expand Catholic Christendom. This ideology, combined with a huge, scattered inheritance of territories, locked Spain into a state of permanent war. Just think about the scale of their commitments. The 80 Years' War was a brutal, endless struggle to crush the Dutch revolt. That conflict alone ate a fortune in men and money. At the same time, Spain was fighting the Ottoman Turks for control of the Mediterranean, fighting a series of wars against France, and, most famously, launching the doomed Spanish Armada against England in 1588. This constant warfare was a gaping wound in the treasury. The costs were astronomical. Philip II's father had already racked up huge debts to fund his wars. Philip continued and expanded this policy, quadrupling the empire's debt in just 2 decades. The money from the Americas, as vast as it was, could never keep up. And the burden of paying for all this fell almost entirely on Castile. The Castilian taxpayers and American silver paid for nearly everything. This created huge resentment and, as we've seen, led to rebellions when the crown's demands for taxes and soldiers became too much. The cycle was vicious. American silver let Spain fight its endless wars. The endless wars drained the treasury way faster than the silver could fill it. This forced the crown to borrow at insane rates and declare bankruptcy, which destroyed its credit. And the lack of funds meant that troops often went unpaid, leading to mutinies that could derail entire campaigns. The empire's military might was both its greatest source of pride and its greatest financial drain, a tether that stretched its resources so thin that the whole thing was doomed to snap. Section 8. Tether number 3. An inefficient and exempt tax system. An empire is only as strong as its ability to tax its own people. And in this crucial job, the Spanish Empire was a spectacular failure. Its tax system wasn't just inefficient, it was fundamentally unjust, designed to protect the rich and crush the poor. This is our third tether, a medieval tax system totally incapable of funding a modern empire. The core problem was inequality. In Habsburg Spain, the two wealthiest groups, the nobility and the clergy, were largely exempt from direct taxes. Think about how absurd that is. The people with the most money were contributing the least to the state. The main tax burden, the pecho, fell on the commoners, the peasants, artisans, and merchants of Castile. And as we saw, the crown made this problem even worse by selling titles of nobility. Every time a rich merchant bought a title to escape taxes, the tax base shrank, and the load on everyone else got heavier. During Philip II's reign alone, taxes on the peasantry went up by 430%, while their wages only went up by about 80%. This crushed the productive heart of the Spanish economy. The system was also a chaotic mess. There was no single, unified tax code. It was a patchwork of different taxes that had built up over centuries. The alcabala, a sales tax on all transactions, was a nightmare to collect and just encouraged people to cheat. There were taxes on salt, wool, wine, a confusing array of levies that made business difficult. On top of that, the tax system wasn't even the same across the empire. The Kingdom of Aragon, for example, had its own institutions and paid way less into the imperial treasury than heavily burdened Castile. This lack of a centralized, predictable revenue system was a critical weakness. Unlike their rivals in England and the Netherlands, the Spanish kings had no way of knowing how much money they could count on from year to year. The reliance on American silver was a direct result of this broken tax system. The crown turned to the treasure fleets precisely because it couldn't effectively tax its own country's wealth. Silver was a windfall, an easy source of income that didn't require tough political reforms. But it was also volatile. A single storm or a pirate raid could throw the entire state's finances into chaos. A modern tax system would have provided a stable foundation. Instead, Spain's finances were built on a crumbling medieval structure, a tether that ensured it could never turn its massive paper wealth into real, sustainable strength. Section 9. Tether number 2. The Price Revolution and Hyperinflation. And now we get to the direct consequence of that mountain of silver, the economic force that twisted the Spanish economy from the inside out, the price revolution. This is our second tether, the devastating inflation triggered by the flood of American treasure. Today, we understand that if you pump way more money into an economy than there are goods and services, prices will go up. In the 16th century, this was a new and terrifying experience. Spain became the first society in history to deal with massive monetary inflation. Here's a simple way to think about it. A town has 1,000 coins and 1,000 loaves of bread. A loaf costs 1 coin. Suddenly, someone finds a treasure chest with 10,000 new coins and spends them all over town. Now there are 11,000 coins, but still only 1,000 loaves of bread. The price of a loaf is going to skyrocket. This is exactly what happened to Spain. Between the early 1500s and mid-1600s, huge amounts of silver were mined, shipped to Seville, minted into coins, and spent by the crown. It's estimated that prices in Spain went up sixfold over 150 years. An average inflation rate of 1 to 1.5% a year might not sound like much to us, but for a pre-industrial economy used to stable prices, it was a cataclysm. This price revolution had ruinous effects. First, it destroyed the purchasing power of the average person. Wages couldn't keep up with the soaring cost of food and rent. While the nobles and bankers who got the new silver first got richer, the vast majority of Spaniards got poorer. The wealth of the Indies was literally making them hungry. Second, as we mentioned, it made Spanish industry hopelessly uncompetitive. With prices for labor and materials soaring, Spanish-made goods became too expensive to sell. Imports, paid for with silver, flooded the market and killed local businesses. Third, it destroyed the value of the state's own income. The king collected taxes in a currency that was constantly losing its value. The money he got was worth less by the time he could spend it. The inflation acted as a hidden tax on the crown's own revenue. And the Spanish monarchy, which was causing the inflation by pumping the economy full of silver, seemed unable to figure out what was happening. Their solution to every financial problem was just to hope for more silver from the next fleet. This flood of precious metals, which should have been a blessing, instead acted as a potent economic poison. It distorted every aspect of Spanish life, impoverished its people, and ultimately made the crown's vast income meaningless. The empire was drowning in money. Section 10. Tether number 1. Absolute dependency on unpredictable silver fleets. We now arrive at the number 1 hidden tether, the central, fatal flaw of the entire imperial structure: Spain's absolute, crippling dependency on the timely arrival of its American treasure fleets. The entire financial system of Habsburg Spain wasn't a modern fiscal state. It was a high-stakes gamble, placed every single year on a fleet of wooden ships making a treacherous 5,000-mile journey across the Atlantic. The kings didn't just spend the silver they had, they spent the silver they hoped would arrive next year, and the year after that. The crown's loans, the asientos, were effectively payday loans taken out against the future arrival of the fleet. Genoese bankers would provide the cash to pay the army in Flanders, with the loans secured against silver that was still in a mountain in Potosi. This created a system of shocking fragility. As long as the fleets arrived safely and on time, the house of cards could stand. But any disruption to this silver pipeline could trigger a total collapse of the state's credit. And the fleets faced a lot of threats. Hurricanes could send ships loaded with treasure to the bottom of the ocean. Pirates and privateers from England, France, and the Netherlands saw the Spanish galleons as the ultimate prize. The most dramatic example of this vulnerability came in 1628. The Dutch Republic, in the middle of its long war for independence from Spain, finally achieved the impossible. A Dutch privateer named Piet Hein, commanding a fleet for the Dutch West India Company, cornered and captured almost the entire Spanish treasure fleet in the Bay of Matanzas, off the coast of Cuba. The haul was staggering, roughly 90 tons of silver and gold. For the Dutch, it was a national triumph. The money was enough to fund their entire army for 8 months and pay a 50% dividend to the company's shareholders. The capture of the fleet directly financed the Dutch war effort against Spain. For Spain, it was an absolute catastrophe. It wasn't just the loss of the money, which was devastating enough. It was the total implosion of the crown's credit. The king had already borrowed against that silver. Now it was gone, captured by the very enemies he was fighting. Lenders who had fronted the money were wiped out. Confidence in the Spanish crown's ability to ever repay its debts evaporated. It triggered another wave of fiscal crisis and state bankruptcy. This one event laid bare the central weakness of the Spanish Empire. Its power wasn't based on a strong domestic economy or stable institutions. It was based on a long, vulnerable supply chain of metal. This dependency was the ultimate tether. It turned the symbol of Spain's strength, the silver galleon, into the symbol of its fragility. When that lifeline was threatened or, as in 1628, severed, the whole imperial project would begin to collapse. The mountain of silver hadn't made Spain strong, it had made it a hostage to fortune. The story of the Spanish Empire's decline is a timeless cautionary tale. It's the story of a nation that won the greatest lottery in history and ended up bankrupt. It's a story that makes you question what wealth and power even are. Spain didn't collapse because it ran out of silver. It collapsed because of what the silver did to it. The treasure was a corrosive force that warped every institution it touched. It fueled a ruinous inflation that impoverished its people. It created a resource curse that killed domestic industry. It allowed generations of kings to fight endless, unaffordable wars, mistaking a temporary windfall for permanent strength. And it allowed the crown to ignore the deep, structural rot in its own foundations, a corrupt administration, a broken tax system, and a total lack of modern financial institutions. The hidden tethers, from the tired farmlands of Castile to the treacherous waters of the Caribbean, were all connected. Each failure made the others worse, creating a downward spiral that no amount of silver could stop. While its rivals, England and the Netherlands, were building robust economies based on trade, manufacturing, and sophisticated finance, Spain remained tethered to a primitive model. They confused the glitter of treasure for the real substance of wealth. The ultimate tragedy is that Spain's mountain of silver was its undoing. It created the illusion of infinite wealth, which removed any reason to do the hard but necessary work of building a modern state and a productive economy. It's a lesson written in gold and silver, but its message is universal. True national strength doesn't come from what you can dig out of the ground. It comes from the resilience of your institutions, the productivity of your people, and the wisdom to know that no treasure fleet can sail forever. If this story gave you a new perspective on how empires rise and fall, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more deep dives into the hidden mechanics of history. Let us know in the comments, what modern parallels do you see to Spain's resource curse? History often has the answers, if we're willing to look. Thanks for watching.